Hey there! Let's talk about trigonometric Pythagorean identities. And these are going to contain these 6 main functions. And that is sine, cosine, tangent, and the inverses, which are cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And these are very important for identities because these are the only and the pretty much the basic things you'll need to know. And you need to memorize that the inverse pretty much means that it's the reciprocal of the thing. So sine is 1 over cosecant, that's the same thing, and cosecant is the same thing as 1 over sine. And you'll need to memorize this. So cosine is 1 over secant, and secant is 1 over cosine. Tangent is 1 over cotangent, and cotangent is 1 over tangent. Make sure you don't get your cosecant and secant mixed up, because even though sine is not like with secant, it's actually with the reverse. So when you think sine, think cosecant, because SC, and for cosine, it's CS. Alright, so now let's move on to Pythagorean identities. The first one is sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. And so why is this equal to 1? Well, let's draw out a triangle. Let's say this is x. So we know that sine is normally the opposite over the hypotenuse. So sine would be opposite, hypotenuse, and adjacent. This part would be sine, and cosine would be this part. The part that overlaps when you add cosine and sine together is the hypotenuse, because they both share that in common. So actually, when you add sine, let's say sine is the opposite, and cosine, which is the adjacent, when you add them together, they actually get your hypotenuse, which in this case we're using the value 1. So cosine plus sine equals 1. And that's really important to remember, that the squares of these equal 1. And that's going to be a really key concept here for trigonometric identities. The next one we're going to use is 1 plus tangent squared of x equals secant squared x. And in this one, we have to find a common denominator. And we need to make this in terms of sine and cosine. So let's say we know secant is 1 over cosine. So let's solve for that. 1 over cosine squared x. And that means we have to make everything else in terms of cosine. So let's say this 1 we can also rewrite as cosine squared x over cosine squared x. That cancels out to be 1. And tangent. Well, we know the tangent is opposite over adjacent, right? But we also just said that sine is the opposite and cosine is the adjacent. So we could also rewrite tangents as sine squared x over cosine squared x. And now, as you can see, we actually have all of a common denominator. So we can just say cosine squared x plus sine squared x equals 1. And that is exactly the same thing as our original identity. So this is also true because of the same concept here. Let's go to the last one. The last one is 1 plus cotangent squared of x equals cosecant squared of x. And this is very similar to the previous one, but let's walk through it. So we know cosecant is just 1 over sine. So 1 over sine, which is the inverse, and let's write everything else in terms of sine. So sine squared x over sine squared x. And cotangent is just the inverse of tangent, right? And if tangent is sine over cosine, we can say cotangent is just cosine over sine. And now we have all the same denominator again. So now we could say sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1. And that works as well. So let's wrap this up here. So we now understand how to use trigonometric identities. And a key concept to remember is that cosine is the inverse of secant, and cosecant is the inverse of sine. And Another key thing to remember is that tangent equals sine over cosine and cotangent equals cosine over sine. So thank you for watching. This has been Trigonometric Pythagorean Identities provided to you by SATFreePractice.com.